Welcome, everyone. We're about to start. Again, thank you for joining us today for the Conservancy's People Plus Places series. I'm Adrian Scott Fine. I am the Director of Advocacy for the Los Angeles Conservancy. Again, we're very happy that you're all joining us. This series, People Plus Places, is all about how we tell stories about, well, places and people, or people and places, and how these stories are much more real and come alive when the place still exists, even if the person associated with the place is no longer here. And we have we think, a very good, a perfect example of that when we are talking about Sister Mary Corita in her studio on Franklin Avenue, which she occupied as her art studio for much of the 1960s. It is now very much at risk through a development project and a parking lot reconfiguration that calls for its demolition. So it's timely that we're all here today to talk about this, why the studio matters and what you can do. So we'll be talking about how you can help. We'll be talking about how this is a part of recognizing underrepresented places, in this case, certainly a place of women's heritage. And we'll also be talking about how do you look at ordinary looking places, sometimes that have changed physically over time, but they can impart extraordinary stories. So we'll be looking at a lot of different things in terms of that through this discussion today. So again, thank you for joining us as we move forward. And this is where we are right now. I just want to make it very clear that we have a critical hearing coming up on this Thursday before the city's Cultural Heritage Commission, where they will be looking at the pending Historic Cultural Monument nomination for Sister Mary Corita's studio. A city staff recommendation has come out against the nomination, largely on the grounds of integrity and that the building has changed too much over time. Again, we'll talk more about that. What does that mean? And we'll talk more about what you can do to help with this upcoming hearing, but we'll get to that a little bit later. And we'll start with our two speakers today, Nelly Scott and Kathryn Wollan. Nelly Scott is the director of the Creeda Art Center. She's very much, very much our partner in this program today and has spearheaded this effort, including doing the Historic Cultural Monument nomination for the Creeda Art Studio. Kathryn prepared the nomination. So we have two excellent folks to speak with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to them now. I'll come back a little bit later. Again, we will have plenty of time for a conversation, Q&A, so put your Q&A questions in the Q&A, or questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to that. But for now, I want to turn it over to Nelly and Katie.
Thanks so much for the introduction and for everybody attending today. We are so thankful for so many new friends and old friends who have joined us in our effort to support the historical application or the application for historical designation for the space that was once Corita's former studio. My name's Nellie, just as Adrian introduced me, and I am the director of the Creeda Art Center, and I have the great fortune of being Corita's champion and thinking through what her legacy means every single day. The Creeda Art Center is a project of the Immaculate Heart community, and we have a collection of over 30,000 objects, artworks, archives, ephemera, photography. I mean, it's a very vast collection and so rich of history, but also this legacy that Creeda leaves us to think through what does that mean individually, and what are our individual efforts in the collective whole, and really circling around the ethos of love, hope, and justice. And so we are a nonprofit. We get to work in art education and thinking through the pedagogy that she left us. And we just are so fortunate to work for somebody so significant and forward-thinking, and what a major role she has in both art history, but cultural history. And I often jokingly say it's like the 7 degrees of Corita. And if you know, you know, and we certainly have a lot of work ahead of us in sharing her story and her impact. And we thought to kind of kick it off, maybe some of you don't know who Corita is and understand where she sits in the canon of history. So we have a short little video that we thought we would show to give you an overview of who she was. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with her artwork. She should certainly be a household name. You are very familiar with a lot of her pieces, but may not know her name. So we can unpack why that might be later, but let me share the short video. Here.
Corita found inspiration in the everyday. In her screen prints, she combined, distorted, and juxtaposed sources all around her to share ideas about faith, love, and justice. Corita was born Frances Kent in 1918. The Kent family moved to Hollywood when she was 5. At 18, she entered the Religious Order of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, taking the name Sister Mary Corita. In 1947, Corita began teaching in the art department at Immaculate Heart College, and she took up screen printing. Corita wanted her art to be accessible. She used this traditionally commercial medium to widely disseminate her work, and she played with the visual language of consumer and popular culture to reach a broad audience.
Screen printing in and of itself is a very democratic medium. It was a way for her to create a large quantity of works, but even the content itself was very specifically about reaching a wider audience.
Her early work was figurative and religious in nature, with playful hints of where her art would go next. In 1962, she created Wonder Bread.
That piece in particular really stands out. A touch of pop art starts to peek through.
Pop art remained her signature style throughout the rest of the 60s.
They say we have no art. We do everything as well as we can. See, so that you don't have art off in a little niche someplace. You have no distinction between what is art and what is not art. You do everything as well as you can.
By 1964, Corita was head of the art department.
By that time, Immaculate Heart College had received a kind of reputation as being a very liberal and even experimental college. Immaculate Heart College and her print studio became this mecca.
She hosted cultural luminaries like Charles Eames and Buckminster Fuller, who described his time in the art department as among the most fundamentally inspiring experiences of my life. She became one of LA's most important cultural figures and artists.
This is going to be a 2-hour looking session, and there really is enough to look at for 16 hours at least.
Her assignments were pretty notorious. Her assignments always revolved around large quantities of production. And this, of course, would intimidate any student, but it was very deliberate. Do 100 drawings, by tomorrow. And the students would groan and they would think, well, that's more than I can do. And then the next day they would show up with 100 drawings. And it was always part of this process of kind of deconstructing the way that we look.
Sometimes you can take the whole of the world in, and sometimes you need a small piece to take in.
Corita encouraged her students to engage with the world beyond the classroom, both artistically and socially. In 1964, the art department took over the school's annual Mary's Day celebration. Corita and her students transformed the tired event into a joyful happening, while also drawing attention to poverty and world hunger.
You see this kind of prototype for what is later California culture when you think of the 1960s. Flowers in your hair and a real social justice message.
In 1965, Corita made My People, her first overtly political piece. My People features the cover of the LA Times during the Watts Uprising and a quote from a priest who was active in the civil rights movement in Selma.
She knew even in this moment that the newspapers maybe weren't telling the entire story. I think the church didn't want her to necessarily incorporate that into her work, but I don't think she could ethically keep going without addressing what was happening around her.
In 1968, Corita was ready for a change and sought dispensation from her vows. She moved to Boston.
She goes on sabbatical during the summer, and she decides not to come back. It's also within the same year that she creates this incredibly rich series. She calls it a set of heroes and sheroes. This is a moment when she's left the order, and I think it allows her to be a lot more open and liberal.
Her work evolved, influenced by living in a new environment, a secular life, and her battle with cancer.
Her work does change. It's a little more introspective. It's a little more informed by her watercolor practice.
She's still struggling with her cancer diagnosis, and her work becomes a little bit more somber, a little bit of a more pastel-y palette, a little more minimal.
Love is a recurring theme in her later work.
Love is a very common theme in Corita's work, and I think it always comes from a point of humanitarian love. What is our individual responsibility in the collective whole? And when she writes love, that's the type of love she means. It's much bigger than all of us.
She remained active in social causes until her death in 1986.
Corita's groundbreaking art, whether experienced 50 years ago or for the first time today, is powerfully relevant.
Well, that's very jazzy. So I hope that you got to learn a little bit more about Corita. And, when we think of it, it really is just scratching the surface of how important this woman really was. And you can't really unpack her full story without understanding the shared history with the Immaculate Heart College, the order, and now the community, and thinking through the turbulent decade that was the 1960s, and where her art really touched every corner of this nation and arguably internationally. And it's really fascinating that, we kind of are here 1 year later after Creeda Day. Last year in 2019, the city and county awarded her a day in her honor, which is actually November 20th, which was her birthday. And thinking through of this larger commitment to honoring notable figures. But she certainly was very well known during this time, leading into the 50s, the 60s, Harper's Bazaar, LA Times, Roundup of Women of the Year. The list goes on and on. And posthumous, we're consistently receiving acknowledgement of her accolades. And really in the last 5 years, we've seen this larger resurgence, kind of part of the larger cultural conversation that we're all having every day, of maybe looking backwards in order to look forwards, of who has come before us that has made a commitment to change and using their times and talents to do such things. And there's no better figure in my mind to honor in such a way, with thinking of their process and their physical space that so much originated out of. This is where she physically pulled the screens. And I'm really looking forward to really diving in to kind of unpacking some of that. Sometimes when we think about California, really some of our greatest exports are culture. And wow, to be a fly on the wall in this building in the 1960s, I would have just absolutely adored it. But I cannot really talk about this journey without introducing and chatting further with Katie, because it has been a journey. And if you're not in preservation on your day-to-day, we found out, and it felt like a pair of shoes in a dryer. And Katie has been right there alongside us in thinking through, you know, what this building could be. So Katie, how, yeah, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself a little bit further, but I just kind of have to ask, like, you know, why did you get involved with us? And, you know, what drew you to helping us through this?
Well, probably everyone saw, but my name is Katie Wollan, and I did volunteer myself for this project. So, like all things these days, I follow the Creeda Art Center on Instagram, and a few weeks after you posted a photo of the studio, which I recognized the building because I grew up in the neighborhood. So I know that building. I shopped in that building in the 70s when it was a health food store. I've taken my dry cleaning there a few times. Like, I know that place. I know the sort of dips in the parking lot, like in my soul. So I recognized it in the photo, and I had actually not known that history about it. I hadn't known that it was her studio. But I did know because I was, you know, as I said, I grew up there, and my family lived in the neighborhood behind Immaculate Heart for almost 50 years. And so I would have been a very young child in the early 70s. And if you grew up around there, you had a sense that something cataclysmic had happened at Immaculate Heart. Probably couldn't explain it. And you probably were just taking recorder lessons there after school, but you knew something really big had happened there. And I can say in retrospect, I feel like just about every house that I was in before I was 5, in every kitchen, Corita's art was tacked up on the kitchen walls. Like, that just sort of seemed like a little bit of the wallpaper of the world that I lived in. So on a personal level, I mean, I still very much consider that place my home. And so I felt personally connected to that story. So when you posted when you posted that it was proposed for demolition, I knew that you needed somebody who had some background in preservation. So, because you just have to take one look at it right now, and I knew what you would be up against. But I think what I texted you was, so I dialed into a neighborhood council meeting, then they were discussing it, and I listened to it, and I sent you all an email the next day that said, I think that you absolutely should pursue designation. Integrity is going to be a big challenge, but I think it's not insurmountable given the level of significance of Creeda as an artist, and that this was her place of production. And I think that has borne itself out.
Well, we're so thankful. I mean, truly, you know, I think we have to acknowledge that, like, wow, first of all, the fact that we are in a position of privilege of having a staff to think through of her legacy and preserve that. And but I think that there was this moment for us, and I keep thinking of this quote from Daniel Berrigan, who so eloquently puts in an essay about the Creeda Studio, you know, colors and combat, and thinking through of like the work that she was doing there. But you know where you stand and stand there. And you know, our mission every day is to preserve her legacy and think through. So of course we would raise our hands to say, hey, this space matters. It requires we need to look at this. You know, it's bigger than just us. I don't think what I've been introduced in preservation is like everyone's here with a similar heart of thinking through, you know, what are we protecting for future generations? And that's a common discussion in our offices as we think of her artwork. And so we are just so thankful, and I've learned so much, but I really think that your insight and background and care through this process, and
Okay, you can stop.
yeah. No, but I'm thinking of like what I've learned along the way and what you've presented and thinking through where this qualifies, why this building matters.
I think
So,
maybe we can share a little bit with
yeah.
people, with our audience, what the impediments are, sort of where there's maybe a little bit of weakness in the nomination, and really it's just around the current state of the building. It's been altered a little bit. I would actually, do we have a picture of the books today?
Yeah, let me.
Yeah. So what's, I think, really great about this property, well, let me also just add, I mean, I have a longstanding interest in the preservation of properties that are associated with women. That was not what drew me to reach out to the Creeda Art Center and offer my assistance, but going through this process together has revealed some of the real difficulties, not just for properties associated with women, but for women, people of color, LGBTQ. Like, this is really the work of this generation of preservationists, is to find ways to counter the inequity in the representation that we have now. So I think Adrian said at the beginning, and we have talked about, only 3% of Los Angeles's historic cultural monuments are associated with women. I don't want to say associated with women, associated with the contributions of women to the history of the city. So 3% is woefully low. So we just want to find a way to get past that, past the barrier that a property really needs to look exactly like it does historically to be eligible for designation. And that's where we're a little bit hung up right now. That's really the issue that the commission is going to be looking at.
Yeah. And I think that was something that really struck a chord for us in thinking through not only the 3% number, but also how do we widen the road and understand just across the board, like where perhaps institutional bias might come into play, and how there is an opportunity to like lean forward and thinking through what this space could be. And there was a few properties I know that had come up in thinking through other examples in which, we had to lean forward and thinking through how we're protecting and whose history we're sharing, frankly. And that it doesn't have to be a pretty in a bow marble building to qualify for something important to have happened there.
True. History is not a beauty contest. I think we have not shown people a picture of the way the building looks today, and I think it's worth looking at. And
great. Let me
a chance to look at it, and a chance to really consider that it's an opportunity for preservation.
Let me pull that up. In the meantime, I will show people what it did look like when it was her space. Here to give a sense.
Right, so a really modest building. It looks out at Immaculate Heart, and behind it is the grocery store, storefront windows. But essentially just a very typical 1960s commercial storefront box. Not a lot of character defining features is what we would call them from a design standpoint.
Yeah. And I think it's very wonderful. You see her her prints they're hanging in the windows, which is, it's so lovely. Let me, sorry, I'm having issues with this image here. Technical difficulties. But in the meantime, while I cue that up, did you want to tell us more about the space as it relates, into this kind of larger conversation that's happening?
As it relates to just the sort of larger conversation about preservation?
Yeah.
Well, I think we touched on that a little bit before. So, what you're looking at on the right is a picture of the building as it stands today. And you can see there have been some modifications. The storefront windows are gone. And that's a big challenge from a sort of technical preservation standpoint. But one, in my view, that really shouldn't override this level of significance. I think we can still recognize it as essentially the same building. And what I have said sort of off and on as we've gone through this, I mean, I think as a preservationist, you can look at this as really a glass half full or a glass half empty. This is either an opportunity to preserve a tangible association with Corita's history that's otherwise lost forever. And once it's gone, it's gone. And in terms of our so when we designate properties, there are a couple of things that happen. One, it's just assigning it's assigning significance and value. It's creating an official list. Like the National Register, for example, is the official list of properties that are worthy of preservation. That's what we're talking about. But another really key component is that the designation process, once things are designated, it unlocks a toolkit of the full suite of tools for preservation. So access to the Mills Act, access to the Federal Rehabilitation Tax Credit, access to the State Historical Building Code, all of these tools that are really central to successful preservation are really only afforded to properties that have designation. So in sort of being unwilling to sort of broadly apply or, broadly interpret integrity, meaning what it looks like, we sort of compound those inequities. So our 3% of women, or if you saw the LA Times op-ed this morning about the National Register, that I think 8% is the figure they used for women, people of color, everyone we want to include in the full spectrum of the American experience. We're not meeting it. The outcomes aren't what we want. And it's not for lack of history. It's not for lack of historical scholarship. It's for lack of identification and designation. We haven't created a pipeline for it. But I suspect as a preservationist for a long time that a lot of these properties will have similar challenges. And the Creeda nomination is a really good test, and we deserve to have it. And the city of Los Angeles has so much to be proud of from a preservation standpoint. The city has spent the last 2 decades really building up an incredibly robust preservation program. And did a citywide survey. They've looked at, I mean, it's a big program now, and it's great. But if the outcomes are that we can't move new properties into the monument pool, then I think we have some soul searching to do.
Yes, and I'm so glad that first of all, thank you, Adrian, for getting that photo up there. I think there's, this larger conversation that we've had too of like, wow, if the building wasn't yellow, could we actually really look at it? Because it is this kind of interesting yellow at the moment. And, I see some of the questions popping up, and I know that we'll have our Q&A, but I think it's important to address, you know, the larger vision and the commitment to this space and her legacy of what it could be again as a cultural asset for Los Angeles. You know, we pride ourselves on being forward thinking and being equitable. But when you hear numbers like that, you do have to take a moment to think through like how and why that might be happening. And I think that our building is such a good example of visioning a new future too. I think after 2020, we're going to need spaces just like this that are intimate. And should we have the opportunity to make it again a thriving cultural, you know, monument that families can visit and learn about her history and learn about the incredible women at the Immaculate Heart College and what came before them. And, you know, using all of your time and talents for change. You know, we're not anti-development. This is a win-win, in my opinion, of like how great for this building to then be in relationship again to a grocery store where it was once the market basket, where she would take her students and march right into this space and get creating, and a relationship of being just across the street for over a century. You know, we're community stakeholders. We care about our community. And there's this, you know, kind of myth out there that's like, oh, if, you know, an ugly building remains, then it just somehow becomes like a drug-ridden corner. And that's just like not, that's kind of absurd when you look at the economic value that cultural spaces bring to their communities on so many levels. You know, we are a nonprofit. We're committed to our neighbors on every level. And I think if 2020 hasn't shown that and helped us all kind of take pause of what it means to slow look and find gratitude in our neighborhoods, then, you know, I think it's just a moment for us to really, you know where we stand. And I think Los Angeles and Hollywood has an opportunity to do that. And, you know, what an important legacy to teach our children and their children after them, that it's important to stand up for our neighbors and to love them and to start conversations. And art is such an important vehicle for that. And so, yes, if there was an opportunity to have the space return to what it once was, we are very interested in exploring that.
Can I ask a question of you both? And this is more of a devil's advocate question.
Yeah.
Not coming from me, but it speaks to a lot of what we're talking about here. And it gets at what you were talking about, Nellie, about legacy. Some would say, well, Sister Corita's legacy is her artwork, not the building. So how do you counter that?
Well, I have lots of opinions on that. And I think that, you know, that kind of goes along the same line of like, well, why now? And I think you have a larger like unpacking of conversations you need to have around, you know, women artists and in history that I think a lot of art institutions are having. But I think you kind of have to really approach it in, you know, talk to any artist. You know, 90% of what's happening in their art is not the like outcome itself too. And the process of making art is, you can't just categorize art in one thing, of just like one object. And I would probably counter that with, if this space were allowed to maybe return to what it once was as like a cultural asset, what a wonderful invitation and to our neighbors to dive into art, because I think sometimes there are barriers that we all have to acknowledge of this white wall experience that's very intimidating. You know, I think people it's more easily accessible to understand process and to return to a space and understand the hands-on experience of the actual making of the art. You know, we have the archive and we have her artwork, but the process in and of itself is an important part of that story. And I think that we have an opportunity to showcase that.
Can I add to that a little bit?
Yes, please.
I think one really important thing about the historic significance of the studio as it relates to her art, and is that if you spend any time with her art, particularly her art from this period, it's very clear that she is mediating the reforms in the Catholic Church. She's taking that information in, and she's also taking in the information of in the world and in the community around her. What's happening in the 60s, all the sort of social and cultural turbulence, political turbulence of the 60s. And to me, the fact that that small, modest box that created her studio, it's just concrete block walls and a flat roof, sits across the street looking up at the Immaculate Heart community, looking up at the convent and the college, with behind her a brand new grocery store that was, you know, sort of symbolizing all of the consumer culture of the mid 20th century. And that in that studio, her practice, which included her teaching, mostly, she did teach in that space, but also her own production, that's where the alchemy took place. That's where you can understand where she's like mediating all of these ideas and influences concurrently. And I think that one may not be able to immediately digest that in the work itself, but I mean, I'm not an art historian by training. Like I need cues. So to sort of understand it in that box makes it a lot more accessible, a lot more tangible. You see like the concrete influences that were around her. And then, well, I've lost my train of thought. It just happens all the time.
Well, I think, Katie, you bring up a good point that we haven't really touched on, which is, you know, one of these criteria of the nomination of like, would Creeda recognize this building if she was here today? And, you know, while she's not with us, her students are, you know, her legacy is also within her students as an educator. And not only have I had the privilege of reading all of these letters and getting to speak with them often, but they, even if they don't live here in LA, they come back to visit that space. Like it left such a mark in their own personal lives that they bring their families to come back to show like, this is where I worked with Creeda, or this is where I, you know, was so inspired during this time. And they recognize it without a doubt. That, you know, I think there's the Daniel Berrigan essay where, you know, he like, I think he essentially calls it like a shed. Like it's never been, it's a utilitarian space. And because it is so ordinary, it is so extraordinary for what came out of it. And the students recognize that time and time again, without a doubt, as this, it's a box and its location. So yes, you know, it's very clear in her work that this space is tied to those works in the 1960s. Like she's walking into the grocery store, she's coming out, she's going into this space. It's very inspired by. So that probably answers more than the question that you asked, but I think we have such a remarkable building and an application to put forth here that is so unique, and it's more than one thing, more than one history here.
Absolutely. I mean, not to quote Hamilton, the Broadway production, but you know, it's kind of like it's in the room where it happened. It's in the art studio where the art happened. And, you know, when you don't have that connection, you're missing a piece of the story. So everything you said, it's about making those connections. And so I want to tease out a little bit more with you all and the group, you know, what's the obstacle? We've got the story, we've got the person, we've got the art. The one thing standing in the way is it's a modest building that's changed over time. Some people have asked about what happened after Creeda. It was a health food store and a dry cleaners. Did it have any other use before other than those?
That is it. That's all we know. There's a couple of years that are unaccounted for just after she left, but I think in 1972 it became a health food store, and that's actually when they moved the entrance to the side. It was my my presumption is that the storefront windows were damaged in the earthquake in 1971. And at that time, that would be, it's very typical damage. And also at that time, people were enclosing storefront windows, like everywhere, all over the country, for sort of in the wake of the late 60s and early 70s, people were just closing them off. So they, and as I also understand it, it was a Ralph's. I mean, I know it was a Ralph's grocery store, but my research has shown me that that health food store was likely a small project of Ralph's trying to take advantage of that new market. So they, of course, turned the entrance to face the parking lot. So that's it. And then in 1983, it became a dry cleaners, and it's been a dry cleaners now literally for almost 40 years. So in some ways, as I look at it, compared to other small storefronts, it has been subjected to relatively little change. They get changed over frequently. And again, I feel like it's a bit of a glass half full, glass half empty question. So it's really, the main things seem to be, the main concerns seem to be that the storefront windows are gone and that the orientation has changed to the parking lot side. But one advantage that we have in the goal of preserving this building is that, significance and integrity standards were set up 50 years ago because there was a history of landmarking and a monument process that was not based in research. It was not based in fact, it was sort of based in fable and lore. And so we in building up our profession, that's what we did. We sort of set these standards, and they were intended to be interpreted, broadly applied, and to have flexibility. So, we have ourselves here in this situation where there've been a couple of alterations, but I think we still see the basic form. The location is there, the setting is clear, which in this particular case is hugely important to understanding the story. And it's been these two things. The only other significant thing that happened there was in 1983 when it was a dry cleaner. The dry cleaner got slapped with the discrimination lawsuit because he was overcharging women. Not this dry cleaner.
No, the one prior.
Okay.
A delicious irony of history. Yes.
Irony for sure. Well, some people have been asking about, are there other examples of this precedent? So I thought we'd share a few, just to put in some context, because this is not a conversation that's happening in isolation in Los Angeles. It's national in terms of scope. So let me share my screen again. Again, it's been a conversation that certainly all the way up to the national level of the National Trust has been facilitating about this idea of integrity as a barrier or an obstacle, especially for modest, humble-looking places that have, cultural, social history. And again, this percentage, just in LA alone, of such a small percentage that's recognizing women's heritage. But we do have some precedent in California, looking at other examples of buildings that have changed over time, but have still been able to attain historic preservation recognition, whether it's at the national level, state, or local. In this case, as a national historic landmark, where Cesar Chavez, who was a American labor activist, he did much of his work out of this building. And as you can see, from what it looked like originally to what it looks like today, radically changed. There's no question about it. But there also was no question that this building was the only building that really could tell his really important story. And so it went through the process, and it did achieve that level of significance and recognition, even though it's had these alterations. That's at the National Historic Landmark level. We're not talking about that with the Creeda studio. Another example, also from LA, in East LA, is a Silver Dollar bar. And this is something the Conservancy has been working on for the last 5 years with the Chicano moratorium march routes of the late 60s and 1970. And we just achieved National Register listing just within the last month, which we're really thrilled to achieve. But it does bring up a similar example. In this case, a building here, this is the Silver Dollar bar as it looks today. This is as it looked at a similar event during the Chicano moratorium march And it was picked up, even though it said alterations to the storefront as well. It was picked up as a contributing resource as part of the National Register listing of the Chicano moratorium for a significant event, in this case, Ruben Salazar. This is where he was shot and killed that day. And it was listed, but altered building. So then you look at our, beloved Creeda's studio. It's been changed. She was there over not just one day, over years, producing art, making contributions, being recognized at the national level in terms of how she was standing out from others in terms of her contributions in pop art movement. And I think it does bring up questions about how are we excluding or limiting telling the full story. And this was an op-ed that Katie mentioned earlier that was in the LA Times today, talking about it's mostly a white, mostly a male narrative. And how do we push that forward so that we're not excluding or limiting our ability to tell the full story? And I think that's at the heart of what this is all about.
We agree.
So let's take some more questions from folks. And we want to leave you to what you can do, but there are other questions about who currently owns the building and what are some proposed uses. I know, Nellie, you touched on that a little bit, but I don't know if you want to add more to that or not.
Yeah, I think there's so much to kind of speak on. When we put together this application, there's only so much you can fit in 100 pages and how much history and intention we have for this space. I think, we can really speak to the larger unpacking that needs to happen kind of historically and understanding and placing her work, because she is more than one thing. And I think that we would have to say that there's so much more academic and scholarship that is happening that I've learned that, preservation is such a case-by-case basis too, and thinking through the importance of the physicality and our commitment to that space. She really left a mark, and I think that we have to think through that. And I think that there's more to be announced, and I was hoping that maybe we could share some of that today. But there has been a documentary that's been in the works for about 20 years that could maybe answer that here very shortly, and then we can share more widely.
Sounds good. The other thing, just to be clear, I think we've talked about that, maybe not everyone got it, in terms of, is this the only place that can really tell Corita's story in terms of her production of art?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there anywhere else that does that?
No, this is, so Katie had mentioned earlier the earthquake that happened in 1971, and that's certainly why the mother house across the street was razed. So we know that it was a significant earthquake. And so the other part of the Immaculate Heart College is no longer standing, the physical space that was in existence. So this space was a printmaking studio that was an extension of the Immaculate Heart department for many different reasons, right? Printmaking is, if you are a printmaker, you know that there's quite a bit of chemicals, especially in the 60s. So there's a real reason why it would have been moved across the street. And, we've also had a lot of questions around, ownership, which we can kind of unpack. But this is the only space.
Can I jump in quickly?
Yeah.
Short answer is there were two buildings in Los Angeles where she created art and pulled prints. One was the basement of the convent house. The convent house is gone. And the other is 5518 Franklin Avenue, where that was her studio from about 1962. We don't have a clear front date, and ending in 1968 when she left Immaculate Heart. So that is very clean, what we call period of significance. It is clean, it is like directly related to the most defining phase of her artistic career. And additionally, I mean, we focused on the art in our nomination, her as an artist, but certainly that would extend to a broader significance as an art educator and in the history of education, history of religion. But 1962 to 1968 is about when she's there, and it's the only building in Los Angeles or in the country where she actually pulled prints. So this is it.
Before we come closer to the end, I want to just share my screen one last time to tell people what they can do, because this is where we really need people's help coming up for this Thursday. So the nomination goes before the Cultural Heritage Commission on Thursday. Meeting starts at 10 a.m. This is item, I believe, number 6 on the agenda. And so it will be an opportunity for the public to speak. It will be a Zoom, but you can speak and share your comments. And this is really critical that people hear from you, and certainly the Cultural Heritage Commission members, especially in this case, because we have a city staff recommendation that is against the nomination on the grounds that we talked about earlier around integrity, or that this building is too altered to be eligible still. And if you disagree with that or have a different opinion of that, and want to ensure that the Sister Corita studio is recognized, this is a major hurdle we need to get over in terms of this hearing on Thursday. So all this information is on the Conservancy's website. You've got the link there. We'll put it in the chat function as well, so you can go directly to that. Again, you can send your comments before, or you can be there on the meeting itself. That would be probably the most helpful, is to speak at the meeting. Be really helpful. I know the Creeda Art Center certainly would appreciate the support and help for this. But that's really the next major step. And I don't know if Nellie or Kate, you have more to add on that point.
Yeah, I think I keep, saying Thursday is when we need our Whoville song of voices around this building. We have currently on our website, if you go to creeda.org, we have an open letter of support that we're encouraging people to also sign if they're unable to attend on Thursday. But certainly letting the commission know that this is, not only for Los Angeles, but so much bigger. So I know that we have plenty of people on the call today from all over the world, that her influence really stretches, beyond, and, she is a daughter of Hollywood, and we should be so lucky to claim her and create a monument for people to come and recognize and visit. And what an incredible heritage that would be to leave. So yes, so we have a letter of support on our website, creeda.org. Please sign it if you cannot attend on Thursday, and or write in. And we are just so thankful. I think I can't say that enough, for Hollywood Heritage and LA Conservancy and Katie and our larger community that have shown up every step of the way with us here in thinking through not only what this could be, but why this is important and why this matters.
Absolutely. And there's been a bunch of questions, and I'll just pull them together about what could this be? Could this be a tourist destination? How can we acquire the building? All those kinds of things. And Nellie, you've talked some on that, but absolutely, it's got infinite possibilities in terms of this building coming back to really reflect, Creeda's time there. It's doable, but really this first step, again, is, and I can't stress enough, the hurdle is getting the Cultural Heritage Commission to support the nomination on Thursday. Once that happens, it really puts the other things into motion in terms of possibility that the building could find a use that really reflects and showcases Creeda's time there, and that we've celebrated. But if we're not able to make this happen on Thursday, I think it's a major challenge of being able to go forward on some of these things in the future. So, and I can't stress again enough how important it is to recognize the full story. And this is a major story for Los Angeles. And if we can't showcase her contributions through the place in which she operated and produced this seminal amount of art and social justice and around racial inequities and poverty, all the things that were happening then, that are still happening today. She's relevant then, she's relevant today, and this building helps make that relevant by people being able to see and experience it. So that's where we need everyone's support. So we're almost to the end here. I'm going to check to see if we have any last minute questions, but Nellie and Kate, if you have anything else that you really want to impart with everybody before we leave.
I'll let Katie go first.
I will just stress again that Thursday at the Cultural Heritage Commission, I don't want to say it's do or die, but it is the not just the hurdle, but the critical step. And so any additional support we can get from friends, neighbors, citizens far and wide, it would be enormously helpful.
Yeah, just I second all of that. I think what we've been through this nomination is that, you know, this is about more than just us. You know, again, I can't stress it enough of, like, you know, a plaque is something you put up after you've lost something or made a mistake. And this building is set to be demolished if it is not receive historical recognition and designation. And what a loss for 5 more parking spaces versus something that could be something that we can return to and visit and honor. Remarkable work that came before us on many different levels, as you've said, of conversations that we're having today, that they were having you know, in many ways during her time in this space, and she was responding in her artwork. And certainly that's a larger history to unpack and share than 100 pages and her significance. And we have the privilege as citizens of LA to show up and say, this matters to us. And so I do hope that people join us on Thursday, that they sign our letter. This is important, this matters, and we are so grateful for every single voice that can help us do that.
I can't say any better than that. So thank you, Nellie. Thank you, Katie, for being here, joining us, and for your work in bringing this nomination forward to the Creeda Art Center. We really appreciate it. And Katie for volunteering. Thank God you volunteered. We really appreciate that, and appreciate everybody that joined us today and is willing to come out on Thursday to lend your voice to support the effort. If you haven't heard it, you're definitely needed. So again, thank you all. And thank you again for joining People Plus Places, looking at the Creeda Art Studio, and many more to come. So have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, everyone.